So now I'm going to do a quick overview of my development environment because while I'm doing this Data Vault series, I want to explain what I'm doing exactly and how I'm doing it. So you'll notice I'm opening a web browser screen. This is a connection to my server. I have a server that's actually a Dell rack server, which I use for my development environments. If you look at it's got Proxmox installed. It's basically Proxmox is a Debian distribution that allows for virtualization. It's got an open source edition, and it also allows you to host Linux and Windows containers. Linux containers, and Windows virtual machines or Linux virtual machines. Now, LXC containers are really cool because they are very good and frugal with resources. And aside from the virtual machine, how they differ from a virtual machine with Linux containers, they're very similar to Docker containers, for those of you familiar with those. But the difference between Linux containers and Docker containers is that Docker is optimized for one application to run inside a Docker container. It's usually used for development environments. Linux containers can even support infrastructure. You could run a whole Linux distribution with a desktop on a Linux container, and I'll probably do a demo on that one day. But the idea is a Linux container, just like a Docker container, it shares the kernel with the host, but with a Linux container you're actually able to treat it as if it's just a separate machine. Now on the summary you can see I've got 24 CPUs because it's a dual processor, dual socket system. You can see the RAM, I've got 94 gigs of RAM, and you can see the hard disk space that I've used. This is a really cool system because I'm actually booting this from one USB stick, and it's actually got a ZFS partition set up. It's got 3 ZFS, so this data pool is 2 hard disks actually, but they're in one pool, and then there's storage pool, which is another hard disk, and then there's R pool, which is the root pool. Now, why am I showing you this, and how is this relevant to my Data Vault series? The reason this is relevant is now I've got this virtual environment. I can set up virtual machines as much as I want. So what I did before I started this video is I set up a Linux container. This Linux container is basically an Ubuntu host, as you can see, and I'm running a container in it, and you'll notice it's 2019 SQL Server, and I just set it up 15 minutes ago. The cool part about having a virtualized environment with Linux containers and the ability to run containers, so inside that LXC container I've got a Docker container, Docker server installed, and with that I installed the Community Edition. I then just downloaded the Docker image for SQL Server, and then I ran this command, which is a one-liner, and all it does is basically install run an image of Docker SQL Server 2019. Now that's running over here on this server, and I've got another machine that's got Visual Studio on it, and this is a Windows virtual machine. And I like to be generous with my virtual machine, so I gave it 16 cores, 32 gigs of RAM, and it's also running. You'll notice that green play button over here. Now, since that's the case, I can access my Windows machine, so I'll just go in here, and this is a Windows machine. It's actually running on the Linux server. This is my development environment on Windows. This is a local SQL server, and guess what? this is the SQL server that's running on Linux. It's the latest 2019 SQL server. And because I'm inside of virtual LAN, so basically I can see my SQL server that I just installed, and I can connect to it and treat it just like any other database. I can create another database on it. And now you can really play around and do whatever we would do on a SQL Server database. How this is cool is basically now I can basically set up environments very quickly. With Docker, I can set up a Hadoop cluster, I can set up a Kafka cluster, which is going to be one of the demos that I want to do, and possibly MuleSoft if there's such a container. And basically the idea is I took you from end to end, showed the generation of ETL packages, and then showed on the first video how I was able to use OData as the API behind the packages that wraps the packages. Now, with that being said, I open SQL Server, Visual Studio, and I can run the API. Now, when you look at the API, you'll notice that, let me show you an example. We had JSON coming back. We were selecting things from the API that was retrieving data from the data vault and things like that. Basically what I could do then is now use these objects and send them as messages to a Kafka cluster on a queue or a RabbitMQ queue or anything else like that. But it's very simple for me to just easily set up a whole range of environments and test different things on it. So that's what we're going to be having fun doing in the next installment of this series. But I just wanted to share that with you. So here's my terminal services that's running on my Linux box, and that's connecting to my Visual Studio Windows application. When I did my first demo, I was running it on a virtual machine that was running on the local machine, but I'd like to save some processing power and leave this machine for browsing and put all the load on that server. Now, this is a Linux box, so as you can see, it's KDE. What I've also demoed is here, I've got DataGrip, and this is a JetBrains product, and using the IP address from SQL Server, I was able to connect to my server. Oh, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong one. This is SQL Container. I can create a database, but I want to show you the ones that I've already got. So over here, I'm going to connect. I can connect to the actual database. So I just created test2, right? So I'm going to go here. Oh, okay. Test1. And there you go. There's the database that I just created on my virtual machine, and I can also create a new table here. I'm obviously doing the wrong thing over here, so on DBO I'm going to create a new table, and I'm going to call it test table. I'm going to add a column, call it ID. Then I'm going to add another column and call it name. And this is me connecting to it from my Linux box. Let's give it a 50 character. Let's execute. Let's see if this works. And there you go, there's your test table. So I just connected from my Linux box to my virtual machine that has Visual Studio on it and SQL Server, but I also connected to the SQL Server that's on the Linux box. And how we can see that is, let's go back to my virtual machine that's got Windows on it, and here we go. And let's see if what I was saying was true. So let's go to the Object Explorer, and I just said test 1, right? I just created a table on that. So let's refresh and see. As you can see, there's my DBO test table, and I can go script it like this. I highly recommend that a lot of anybody who's got the capability to buy a rack server or an enterprise server off eBay. The reason I think that's a good idea is because if you wanted to buy a laptop that's got 24 processors or 32 with one of those new Ryzen processors, you'd probably be spending thousands of dollars. You can get an enterprise server that's been used on eBay for $100, $200, $300 even. And it'll have all the processing power you need. You put some SSDs on it, and now you've got the capability to create any environment that you like. So I'll just leave you at that, and then the next video I will probably get back to the demo of the Data Vault and maybe look at doing some cool things with Kafka or MuleSoft, or showing like the API integration part of the equation. Thank you.